I never thought I'd end up telling this story. I always brushed off ghost stories as nonsense, something people told to scare each other on camping trips. But that was before what happened last year at the house on Pinebrook Lane. Now, even as I write this, my hands are trembling, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. My friends and I, Jason, Maria, Emma, and me, rented this old Victorian house on the edge of a small town. Jason found it on some obscure vacation rental site, boasting a rustic charm and spooky history. We thought it was perfect for a Halloween weekend. A creepy house, a few bottles of wine, and a Ouija board for laughs. It was supposed to be all fun and games. The house was as eerie as advertised. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by towering pines. Its windows were like dark eyes staring out, and the porch creaked ominously under our feet as we approached. Inside, the air was heavy, as if the place had been holding its breath for years. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the wallpaper peeled at the edges. A massive mirror hung in the entryway, its glass tarnished and warped. Still, we settled in, joking about how we'd be the first ones to die if this were a horror movie. Jason set up his speaker, Maria started unpacking snacks, and Emma found an old journal stuffed into a drawer in the kitchen. It belonged to the previous owner, and as she flipped through the pages, she muttered something about the house being troubled. We laughed it off. The first strange thing happened that night. We were sitting in the living room, playing cards, when the lights flickered. Jason joked that the wiring was older than his grandmother. But then the flickering stopped, and the lights went out completely. "Okay, who forgot to pay the electric bill?" Jason quipped, fumbling for his phone flashlight. That's when we heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from upstairs. At first, we thought it was the wind rattling a window, but the taps grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was knocking. We decided to ignore it and called it a night, splitting into 2 rooms. Jason and I took the room at the end of the hall, while Maria and Emma stayed across from us. I remember lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to convince myself the house was just old and creaky. But then I heard whispers. At first, I thought Jason was talking in his sleep, but when I turned to him, he was wide awake, staring at the door. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. The whispers were faint, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. We couldn't make out any words, but they were definitely there, growing louder by the second. Then, a loud bang came from the hallway, like something heavy had fallen. Jason and I shot out of bed and opened the door to find Maria and Emma standing there, pale as sheets. "Did you hear that?" Maria asked. We nodded, and without saying a word, we all crept toward the source of the noise. It led us to the mirror. The glass was cracked, a jagged fracture running through the center. None of us had touched it. "Maybe it's from the temperature change?" Emma offered weakly. Jason ran his fingers over the crack, shaking his head. "This wasn't here before." We were all unnerved, but we tried to laugh it off and went back to bed. That was our first mistake. The next day, things escalated. Objects started moving on their own. Keys sliding across the counter, chairs shifting inches when no one was looking. At one point, the kitchen cabinet doors all slammed open simultaneously. Maria screamed, and Jason tried to explain it away as old hinges, but by that evening, even he couldn't pretend everything was fine. We decided to use the Ouija board. It felt like the worst idea in the world, but at the time we thought maybe we could communicate with whatever was in the house. Maybe it would leave us alone if we acknowledged it. Stupid, I know. We lit candles and sat in a circle on the living room floor, the board in the center. First, nothing happened. Then the planchette moved. It was subtle at first, like a soft tug, but soon it slid across the board with force. "Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. GLP. What do you want? Maria asked. GTOUT. The candles flickered violently, and one by one, they went out. In the darkness, we heard it again, whispers louder this time, closer. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I swear I felt something cold brush against my arm. Then chaos. The furniture started shaking. Books flew off the shelves, and the old chandelier above us began to sway dangerously. Jason yelled for us to run, but before we could move, the mirror in the entryway shattered completely. A deafening crash echoed through the house, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the shards of broken glass, tall, shadowy, with glowing eyes. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My brain struggled to process what I had just seen, what I was still seeing. The figure was there, unmistakable, standing amidst the jagged pieces of the mirror. Its form seemed to flicker, as if it were being pulled in and out of existence, but those glowing eyes remained fixed on me, piercing, cold, and full of malice. Jason grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the front door. "Go now," he shouted, his voice shaking. I stumbled after him, my legs feeling like they were wading through thick, invisible mud. Behind us, the sounds of destruction intensified. Furniture was overturning, the floorboards groaned, and the walls seemed to shudder with each step we took. Maria screamed. It was the kind of scream that rips through your chest and makes you realize how close you are to the edge of something terrible. I turned my head just in time to see her fall. She wasn't tripped by anything. It was as if she'd been shoved by an invisible force. She hit the ground hard, her face twisted in pain. "Help her!" Emma shouted, frozen in the middle of the hallway. Jason and I doubled back, grabbing Maria under the arms and hoisting her to her feet. "Go, go, go!" Jason yelled again, his voice now barely audible over the deafening cacophony around us. The air had changed. It felt heavier, denser, like we were walking through a storm. As we reached the front door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. Jason grabbed the doorknob, twisting and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he shouted, frantically yanking harder. I tried to help, but no matter how much we pulled, it wouldn't open. Emma was sobbing now, clutching Maria, who looked pale and dazed. And then the whispers returned. They were louder than before, as if they were coming from all directions at once. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, angry, mocking. The sound filled my ears, drowning out everything else. The whispers weren't just around us. They were inside me, crawling through my skull like writhing insects. The chandelier above us swayed violently, the chains groaning under its weight. "Move!" Jason yelled, pulling me toward the staircase. We didn't know where we were going. We just needed to get away from whatever was coming for us. We ran upstairs, the old wooden steps creaking and splintering beneath our feet. Behind us, the front door burst open with a crash, and I thought, for a fleeting moment, that we were free. But then I realized it wasn't the wind or some miracle that had flung it open. It was the thing. I didn't dare look back. The air felt electric, like a storm about to break, and I could hear heavy, deliberate footsteps on the hardwood floor below. They didn't belong to any of us. We burst into the first room we came to, slamming the door shut and shoving a dresser in front of it. Jason leaned against the wall, panting, his face slick with sweat. Maria sat on the floor, clutching her ankle. It looked twisted, swollen. Emma was pacing, muttering under her breath. None of us could form a coherent plan. We were too scared to think straight. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, the floor, even the ceiling. And then, without warning, everything went silent. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than the noise. We waited, holding our breath, Every muscle in our bodies tensed. The quiet stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. Then came the knock. A single, deliberate knock on the other side of the door. We all froze. Another knock, louder this time, followed by the sound of scratching, long, slow, deliberate. The dresser began to rattle. Jason grabbed a chair and held it like a weapon, though I could see his hands trembling. "Who's there?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a voice, low, guttural, and distorted, like it was speaking through water. "You shouldn't be here." The dresser slid away from the door as if it weighed nothing. The door creaked open, and for the second time that night, I saw it, the shadowy figure with glowing eyes. It ducked slightly to step through the doorway, its form impossibly tall, its edges flickering like smoke. It didn't walk so much as glide toward us, the air growing colder with every inch it moved. Jason swung the chair at it, but it passed through the figure as if it were striking air. The chair shattered against the wall, and the thing let out a sound, a deep, resonating growl that seemed to shake the very room. Maria screamed again, and the lights in the room flickered violently. Emma grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the window. "We have to jump," she yelled. I hesitated. We were on the second floor, and the drop was easily 15 feet. But as the figure advanced, its glowing eyes locked on us, I realized there was no other choice. "Help Maria!" I shouted to Jason as I threw open the window. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the icy presence in the room. Jason lifted Maria as best he could, and together we managed to hoist her through the window. One by one, we jumped. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my knees and sending pain shooting through my legs. Jason landed next to me, helping Maria up, and Emma followed seconds later. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent except for the faint creaks and groans of its old wooden frame. "Get to the car," Jason said, his voice hoarse. He wrapped Maria's arm around his shoulder to support her as we half stumbled, half sprinted across the gravel driveway. The stones crunched under our feet, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. Emma reached the car first, wrenching open the back door and climbing inside. Jason helped Maria into the passenger seat while I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped them twice. When I finally slid into the driver's seat, Jason slammed the door behind him. "Go!" he shouted, and I didn't need to be told twice. The car roared to life and I threw it into reverse, my foot slamming the gas pedal. The tires skidded on the loose gravel before catching, and we lurched backward onto the main road. I didn't even check for traffic as I turned, speeding away from the house as fast as the car would take us. None of us spoke at first. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and Maria's ragged breathing. She was clutching her ankle, her face twisted in pain. Emma was curled into herself in the back seat, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly. I saw it," Maria whispered, breaking the silence. "It was right behind us." Jason turned to her, his face pale. "What do you mean, right behind us?" Maria nodded toward the rear window. "When we were running, it was there, on the stairs." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. The road behind us was empty, just an endless stretch of darkness. But that didn't make me feel any safer. "It didn't follow us," Jason said, more to himself than anyone else. "It can't follow us. Are you sure about that?" Emma's voice was barely audible, but there was an edge of panic to it, because I don't think it wanted us to leave. I think we pissed it off. I didn't respond. Couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. and every shadow along the roadside looked like it was moving, shifting, waiting. We drove for over an hour, not stopping until we reached the next town. It was a small, quiet place, and the only sign of life was a 24-hour diner with a flickering neon sign. I pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine. For a long time, none of us moved. Jason broke the silence. What the hell was that thing? No one answered. What could we say? None of us had an explanation for what we'd seen, for what had happened. Emma finally spoke. We shouldn't have stayed in that house. We shouldn't have. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Maria winced as she shifted in her seat. I don't think it was the house, she said quietly. I think it was the mirror. We all turned to her. What are you talking about? Jason asked. The mirror, Maria repeated. I don't know, it was like whatever was trapped in there got out. Her words sent a chill down my spine. The image of the figure standing in the shards of broken glass flashed through my mind. The way it had seemed to emerge from the wreckage, almost like it had been released. We didn't just see it, Emma said softly. It saw us. Jason shook his head. We're not going back there. Whatever that thing was, it's staying in that house. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. The air in the car felt heavy, like the tension was pressing down on all of us, and I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror. We should call someone, Maria said. Tell them what happened. Tell them what? Jason snapped. That we were chased out of an old house by a ghost? You think anyone's going to believe that? Maria didn't argue, but the look on her face said she knew he was right. We spent the rest of the night at a cheap motel down the road. Jason paid for the room, and we all crammed into the 2 small beds, too afraid to separate. None of us slept much. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, set us on edge. At one point, around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard whispers again. Faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my skin crawl. I sat up, straining to listen, but the room was silent. Jason was snoring softly, and Maria and Emma were huddled together, their breathing slow and even. I told myself it was my imagination, but I didn't close my eyes for the rest of the night. In the weeks that followed, we tried to go back to our normal lives, but things were different. Jason threw himself into work, avoiding any mention of that night. Maria started having nightmares, waking up screaming more than once. Emma stopped answering texts altogether, retreating into herself. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started noticing little things. A book falling off a shelf, the lights flickering in my apartment, cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. And then there were the whispers, faint, distant, but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was just me, that my mind was playing tricks on me after what we'd been through. But one night, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. A shadow, tall and flickering, just for a second. And in the glass, 2 glowing eyes staring back at me.